They called her a replacement, a second choice thrown together when their careful plans crumbled like autumn leaves. But Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell carried within her heart a strength that no telegram could capture, a warmth that no photograph could convey, and a fierce determination that would transform not just her own destiny, but the heart of a man who thought he had given up on love entirely. The November wind cut across the Wyoming territory like a blade fresh from winter's forge, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh season ahead. Sarah pressed her gloved hands against the train window, watching the endless expanse of golden prairie grass bend and sway beneath an iron-gray sky. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and uncertain, framed by auburn hair that refused to stay properly pinned despite her morning efforts. She was 26 years old, which made her practically an old maid by most standards, and she was traveling toward a man who had never seen her face, never heard her voice, and who had originally intended to marry someone else entirely. The telegram in her reticule crinkled as the train swayed. Its words burned into her memory through countless readings. Stop. Original bride unable to travel. Stop. Sister recommends you as suitable replacement. Stop. Arrive Sweetwater November 15th. Stop. Jack Morrison. Stop. Suitable replacement. The words stung even now, 3 days after receiving them. Not chosen for herself, not desired for her own qualities, but simply available when the first choice fell through. Before we continue, let us know where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let us get back to the story. The conductor's weathered face appeared at her shoulder as he made his way down the aisle, checking tickets one final time. You will be getting off at Sweetwater, miss. About 20 minutes now. His voice carried the kindness of a man who had seen countless travelers, many of them as nervous as she appeared to be. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words. 20 minutes until she met Jack Morrison, a cattleman who owned a spread outside town and needed a wife before winter set in hard. 20 minutes until she discovered whether she could make a life with a stranger, whether she could find belonging in this vast and unforgiving landscape. She had left behind a cramped boarding house room in St. Louis, a job mending clothes for ladies who looked through her as if she were invisible, and the constant reminder that her younger sister Margaret had married well while Sarah remained alone. Margaret, who had recommended her for this position when her own friend Helen had taken ill and could not make the journey west. Margaret, who had written to Jack Morrison explaining that Sarah was practical, hardworking, and experienced in keeping house. All true statements, but they made her sound like a piece of serviceable furniture rather than a woman with dreams and fears and a heart that yearned for something more than mere suitability. The train began to slow, its whistle cutting through the wind with a mournful sound that seemed to echo the uncertainty in Sarah's chest. Through the window, she caught her first glimpse of Sweetwater, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around the railroad tracks like birds seeking shelter from a storm. The town looked smaller than she had imagined, more vulnerable against the immense sky that stretched endlessly in every direction. As the train shuddered to a halt, Sarah gathered her belongings with hands that trembled only slightly. She had traveled nearly 1,000 miles to meet a man who might or might not be waiting for her, who might or might not find her acceptable as a replacement for the woman he had originally chosen. The weight of that uncertainty pressed against her chest like a stone, but beneath the fear lay something else, something that had carried her through the lonely years in St. Louis and now brought her to this moment. Hope, fragile and flickering perhaps, but undeniably present. The depot platform was nearly empty, swept clean by the relentless wind that seemed to rule this country. Sarah stepped down from the train car, her traveling dress whipping around her legs, her eyes scanning the few figures who had gathered to meet the afternoon arrival. There, standing apart from the others with his hat pulled low against the wind, was a tall man in a brown coat who could only be Jack Morrison. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 32 or 33, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical labor and a stillness about him that suggested a man comfortable with solitude. His face, what she could see of it beneath the brim of his hat, was weathered by sun and wind, marked by the kind of lines that came from squinting against bright skies and enduring harsh winters. When he saw her looking in his direction, he straightened and approached with the measured gait of a man who did not hurry unless circumstances demanded it. "Miss Hartwell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, rough around the edges like leather that had seen hard use. "I'm Jack Morrison." Sarah felt her heart beating against her ribs as she met his eyes, which were the color of winter pine trees and held an expression she could not quite read. "Mr. Morrison," she replied, offering a small curtsy that felt suddenly foolish in this windswept place. "I hope my journey was not inconvenient for you." Something flickered across his features, gone too quickly for her to interpret. "Not inconvenient," he said after a moment. "I brought the wagon. We should get you out of this wind before it picks up worse." He reached for her trunk without waiting for her response, lifting it with an ease that spoke of considerable strength. Sarah followed him to a sturdy wagon drawn by 2 horses who stood patiently despite the wind that ruffled their manes. Jack loaded her belongings with efficient movements, then offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. His touch was brief, impersonal, but Sarah felt the calluses on his palm and the careful way he steadied her as she climbed up. These were the hands of a man who worked for his living, who knew the weight of responsibility and the cost of survival in this harsh country. When he settled beside her and took up the reins, she was acutely aware of his presence, the way he filled the space with a quiet intensity that spoke of depths she had yet to fathom. The ride to his ranch passed mostly in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the whisper of wind through the grass. Sarah found herself stealing glances at his profile, noting the firm set of his jaw, and the way his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead as if he were navigating through dangerous territory. Perhaps he was, she thought. Perhaps they both were. The Morrison ranch house appeared gradually against the horizon, a low structure built of logs and stone that seemed to grow from the prairie itself. It was larger than Sarah had expected, with a wide front porch and several outbuildings arranged in a practical square that suggested prosperity and careful planning. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line that the wind immediately caught and scattered, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows like a promise of sanctuary from the approaching night. Jack brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house and set the brake with a deliberate motion. He sat for a moment without moving, his hands still gripping the reins, and Sarah sensed that he was gathering himself for something difficult. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I should be honest with you about the circumstances that brought you here." Sarah folded her hands in her lap and waited, knowing that whatever he was about to tell her would either ease her fears or confirm her worst suspicions about being second choice, a replacement for something better that had fallen through. "Helen Cartwright was supposed to be my bride," he continued, still not looking at her. "We had been corresponding for 6 months. She seemed suitable, practical. But when she took ill and could not make the journey, your sister wrote to recommend you in her place. She said you were a woman of good character who understood the demands of frontier life." He paused, and Sarah heard in that silence all the things he was not saying. That he had wanted Helen, not her. That she was here by accident rather than choice. That he was making the best of a disappointing situation. "I want you to know," he went on, his voice dropping lower, "that I will honor the arrangement if you choose to stay. You will have a home here, protection, and a position as my wife if that is what you want. But I will not pretend that this is how I expected things to unfold." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and something sharper that might have been anger. She had traveled across half the country to marry a man who spoke of honoring arrangements as if she were a business contract rather than a woman with feelings and hopes of her own. "Mr. Morrison," she said, finding her voice at last, "I appreciate your honesty, but I think you should know that I did not travel all this way to be anyone's consolation prize. I came here because I hoped to build a life with someone who might value what I have to offer, not merely tolerate my presence because circumstances left you without alternatives." For the first time since they had met, Jack turned to look at her directly, and Sarah saw surprise flicker in those wintergreen eyes. She had clearly said something he had not expected, something that challenged his assumptions about who she was and what she wanted. "I did not mean to suggest," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that did not come easily to him. "I apologize if I gave offense. That was not my intention." "No offense taken," Sarah replied, though that was not entirely true. "I simply want us to understand each other clearly. I am here because I choose to be, not because I had no other options. And if I decide to stay, it will be because I believe we might build something worthwhile together, not because I am willing to settle for less than I deserve." Jack studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah had the distinct impression that she was being measured against some internal standard he had not shared with her. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and climbed down from the wagon. "Then let us start again," he said, offering his hand to help her down. "Welcome to the Morrison Ranch, Miss Hartwell. I hope you will find it suitable to your needs." There was something different in his voice now, a note of genuine courtesy that had been absent before. Sarah accepted his assistance and found herself standing in the ranch yard as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that transformed the harsh landscape into something unexpectedly beautiful. The house was warm and well-appointed, with furniture built for comfort rather than display and windows that let in the maximum amount of precious light. Jack showed her to a bedroom that would be hers alone, a courtesy that spoke of his understanding that their arrangement, whatever it might become, would develop gradually rather than be forced by circumstances. "Mrs. Chin will be by in the morning," he explained as Sarah set her small valise on the quill-covered bed. "She helps with the heavy work and cooking when needed. You will not be expected to manage everything alone." Sarah nodded, grateful for this consideration. She had worried about being isolated, cut off from any female companionship or assistance in learning the ways of this new place. That evening, they shared a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, sitting across from each other at a table built for a family rather than two strangers feeling their way towards some kind of understanding. Jack was not much of a talker, but Sarah found that his silence was not uncomfortable. There was something restful about his presence, a steadiness that spoke of a man who did not waste words but could be counted upon when words were needed. After supper, she helped clear the dishes despite his protests, wanting to establish from the beginning that she intended to contribute rather than merely exist as a decoration or burden. As they worked together in the lamplight, their movements gradually finding a rhythm that avoided collision or awkwardness, Sarah began to sense possibilities she had not expected. Jack Morrison might not have chosen her originally, but he was not a man who seemed inclined to cruelty or dismissiveness. He treated her with a careful courtesy that suggested respect, even if affection remained to be discovered. And there was something in the way he moved through his own space, the competence and quiet confidence of his actions, that spoke of qualities she could admire and perhaps, in time, learn to love. The next morning brought Mrs. Chen, a small, efficient woman whose English was accented but perfectly clear and whose smile warmed Sarah immediately. Mrs. Chen had been helping Jack manage his household since his previous housekeeper had married and moved to Denver, and she seemed genuinely pleased to have another woman's company at the ranch. "Mr. Jack, he is good man," Mrs. Chen confided as they worked together preparing the noon meal. "Very lonely since his brother died. Needs wife to make house feel like home again." Sarah learned that Jack had inherited the ranch from an older brother who had built it from nothing but had died of pneumonia the previous winter, leaving Jack to manage an operation that had been designed for two men to run together. The weight of that responsibility explained much about the careful way Jack approached decisions, the way he seemed to measure every word before speaking. Over the following days, Sarah began to understand the rhythms of ranch life and her potential place within them. Jack rose before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, returning for breakfast with mud on his boots and hay in his hair, looking like a man who had already accomplished more before sunrise than most people managed in a full day. He was unfailingly polite to Sarah, asking about her comfort and needs, but maintaining a distance that felt both respectful and somehow disappointing. Sarah threw herself into making the house truly comfortable, mending curtains and organizing supplies with an efficiency that clearly surprised Jack. She had learned in her years of independence to make the most of limited resources, to create warmth and welcome from whatever materials were available. The ranch house responded to her efforts like a plant given proper care, seeming to exhale some of the loneliness that had settled into its corners. It was during her second week at the ranch that the first real test of their partnership arrived in the form of an early blizzard that swept down from the north with a fury that caught everyone unprepared. Jack had been out checking on cattle when the storm hit, and by evening, he had not returned to the house. Sarah found herself pacing the kitchen as the wind howled around the house and snow piled against the windows with alarming speed. Mrs. Chen had been unable to make the journey from town due to the weather, leaving Sarah alone to worry about a man she barely knew but for whom she felt a growing concern that surprised her with its intensity. When the kitchen door finally burst open near midnight, Jack stumbled through it covered in snow and ice, his face gray with exhaustion and cold. Sarah rushed to help him out of his frozen coat, her hands working quickly to assess whether he had suffered frostbite or other injury. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry she made no attempt to hide. "What happened out there?" "Found some cattle trapped in a ravine," Jack replied through chattering teeth. "Had to dig them out before they froze. Lost my horse on the way back, had to walk the last 3 miles. Sarah guided him to a chair near the stove and began heating water for tea, her mind racing through the things that needed to be done to warm him safely. She had learned about treating cold exposure during her time in St. Louis, when winter claimed its share of the poor and unprepared. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," she said firmly, already reaching for blankets. "And we need to warm you gradually or your body will go into shock." For a moment, Jack simply stared at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. Then he nodded and began working at his frozen buttons with stiff fingers while Sarah heated stones by the fire to wrap in cloth for warming his feet. What followed was the most intimate evening they had yet shared, though nothing improper passed between them. Sarah tended Jack with the competence of a woman who understood that survival sometimes required setting aside social conventions in favor of practical necessity. She warmed his hands between her own, fed him hot soup a spoonful at a time when his fingers were too stiff to hold the spoon, and sat with him by the fire until his shivering finally stopped and healthy color returned to his face. "You saved my life tonight," Jack said quietly as the storm continued to rage outside. "I would not have made it much longer in that cold." "Anyone would have done the same," Sarah replied, though they both knew that was not entirely true. Not everyone would have known what to do, and fewer still would have done it with such calm efficiency. "Not anyone," Jack said, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight. "Most people would have panicked, or done the wrong things, or simply waited helplessly for morning." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or simple appreciation. Sarah saw in Jack's expression a dawning awareness that she was not merely a suitable replacement for someone else, but a woman with qualities uniquely her own, qualities that might prove essential rather than merely adequate. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them together in the house with only each other for company. Far from being awkward, the enforced intimacy allowed them to discover compatibilities they had not expected. Jack, it turned out, was well-read despite his quiet manner, with strong opinions about books and current events that he shared more freely when the conversation did not feel forced. Sarah found herself laughing at his dry observations about their neighbors and nodding in agreement with his thoughtful assessments of political developments. More importantly, they began to work together with an ease that suggested natural partnership rather than mere coexistence. When the roof began leaking in the back bedroom, they combined their efforts to move the furniture and set out pans to catch the drips. When the supply of firewood began running low, Sarah proved unexpectedly capable with an axe, splitting kindling while Jack tackled the larger logs. By the time the storm cleared and normal life resumed, something fundamental had shifted between them. Jack no longer treated Sarah like a well-mannered guest who might leave at any moment. Instead, he began including her in decisions about the ranch, asking her opinion about purchases and improvements, discussing plans for the coming spring as if her presence in them was assumed rather than questioned. Sarah, for her part, began to see in Jack Morrison not just a man willing to provide her with security, but someone whose quiet strength and thoughtful nature appealed to parts of herself she had nearly forgotten existed. She found herself looking forward to his return each evening, enjoying the comfortable silence that often settled between them as they shared the day's final meal. Christmas arrived with unusual warmth, as if the early blizzard had exhausted winter's fury and left behind a gentler season. Sarah had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and the tentative courtship that had developed between them had progressed to the point where Jack sometimes took her hand to help her over rough ground, and she had begun mending his shirts without being asked. On Christmas Eve, Jack surprised her by producing a small wrapped package that he placed beside her plate at supper. "I was not sure what you might like," he said, suddenly seeming younger and less certain than his usual composed self. "But I wanted you to have something to mark your first Christmas here." Inside the paper, Sarah found a delicate silver locket engraved with her initials in flowing script. When she opened it, she discovered that Jack had somehow obtained a small photograph of the ranch house and fitted it inside. "So you will always have a picture of home," he explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift, at the implication that he considered the ranch to be her home rather than merely her temporary residence. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Jack. More than I can properly express." She had prepared a gift for him as well, a warm scarf knitted from wool she had purchased in town during one of their supply trips. When he unwrapped it, his fingers traced the careful stitches with something approaching wonder. "You made this yourself," he said, and it was a statement rather than a question. "I wanted to give you something useful," Sarah replied. "Something that would keep you warm when you were working outside." Jack wound the scarf around his neck, and Sarah was struck by how the deep blue wool brought out the color of his eyes and softened the harsh angles of his weathered face. "I have never owned anything so fine," he said simply, and Sarah understood that he was talking about more than the scarf itself. That night, as they sat by the fire sharing the bottle of wine Jack had been saving for a special occasion, Sarah realized that somewhere in the past weeks, she had stopped thinking of herself as a replacement bride and had begun to feel like simply a bride, a woman preparing to build a life with a man she was learning to love. The realization came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of sunrise, natural and inevitable, and somehow exactly right. She looked at Jack, who was staring into the fire with an expression of contentment she had never seen on his face before, and knew that he was experiencing something similar. "Sarah," he said suddenly, as if her name had been pulled from him without conscious decision. "Yes," she replied, turning to face him fully. "I want you to know that I no longer think of you as Helen Cartwright's replacement. I think of you as Sarah Hartwell, the woman who came west and made this house into a home, who probably saved my life during that blizzard, and who has given me something I did not realize I was missing." "What is that?" Sarah asked, though she thought she might already know the answer. "The possibility of happiness," Jack said simply. "Real happiness, not just contentment or the absence of loneliness, but the kind of joy that comes from sharing your life with someone who truly sees you and chooses to stay anyway." Sarah felt her heart swell with an emotion too large and complex for any simple name. This was not the desperate passion of storybooks, but something deeper and more sustainable, built on respect and compatibility and the kind of affection that grew stronger rather than weaker with familiarity. "I choose to stay, Jack," she said, reaching across the space between them to take his hand. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, and not because this arrangement is merely suitable, but because I choose you. I choose this life we are building together." Jack's fingers closed around hers with gentle firmness, and Sarah saw in his eyes a reflection of her own wonder at how something that had begun as a practical arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had dared to hope for. They were married on New Year's Day in a simple ceremony at the church in Sweetwater, with Mrs. Chun and half the town in attendance to witness the union of two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for, even when they had not known they were searching at all. As winter gave way to spring and Sarah settled completely into her new life, she often thought about the telegram that had brought her west, with its impersonal reference to her as a suitable replacement. She had indeed replaced Helen Cartwright, but not in the way anyone had originally imagined. She had not stepped into a role meant for someone else, but had instead created an entirely new role, one that fit her perfectly because it had been shaped by her own hands and heart. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Sarah's practical skills complementing Jack's expertise with cattle and land. They hosted barn dances and holiday gatherings that brought the scattered community together, with Sarah's gift for hospitality turning their home into a center of warmth and welcome for miles around. But perhaps most importantly, they had found in each other the kind of partnership that made both of them stronger and more complete than either could have been alone. Jack's quiet strength gave Sarah the security to bloom into the woman she had always had the potential to become, while Sarah's warmth and wisdom helped heal the loneliness that had marked Jack's life since his brother's death. On a warm evening in late spring, As they sat together on their front porch watching the sun set over land that now felt completely like home, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west as a replacement bride, a second choice in someone else's story. But she had stayed to become the heroine of her own story, a woman who had found love not by accepting less than she deserved, but by refusing to be anyone's consolation prize and instead becoming someone's first and only choice. The wind that had seemed so harsh and unwelcoming on her first day in Wyoming now felt like a friend, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of another day in a life that had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. And as Jack reached over to take her hand in his, Sarah knew that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin not with perfect planning, but with the courage to embrace the unexpected and transform it into something wonderful. What started as a replacement had become irreplaceable, and Sarah Elizabeth Morrison finally understood that she had never been second choice at all, but had simply been waiting for the right story to begin.